Political financing is a crucial aspect of any democracy. It allows political parties and candidates to fund their campaigns and communicate their message to the electorate. However, the intersection of money and politics is often fraught with controversy. This is especially true in India, where the introduction of electoral bonds in 2017 has sparked intense debate. Electoral bonds are financial instruments that allow anonymous donations to political parties. Proponents argue that they enhance transparency by moving away from cash donations. Critics, however, contend that the anonymity they offer undermines transparency and facilitates black money in politics. This essay delves into the complexities of India's electoral bond scheme, examining its purpose, process, and the arguments for and against it. It also explores the impact of electoral bonds on political transparency and accountability, public opinion, and global comparisons. The debate surrounding electoral bonds raises fundamental questions about the relationship between money and politics in India. It underscores the need for a transparent and accountable system of political financing that upholds democratic values. The essay concludes by analyzing the future implications of electoral bonds and the potential need for reforms to ensure a level playing field in Indian politics. The aim is to provide a comprehensive understanding of this controversial policy and its implications for Indian democracy. The influence of money in politics is a global phenomenon. Political parties and candidates require funding to run their campaigns, publicize their platforms, and reach out to voters. However, the sources of this funding and the ways in which it is used can have a significant impact on the integrity of the electoral process. In many democracies, political financing is subject to regulations and disclosure requirements to ensure transparency and accountability. Historically, political donations in India were primarily made in cash, often with limited transparency. This lack of transparency raised concerns about the influence of undisclosed funds on political decision-making. The introduction of electoral bonds aimed to address these concerns by providing a more formal and transparent mechanism for political donations. However, the anonymity associated with electoral bonds has created new challenges for transparency and accountability. The debate over electoral bonds highlights the ongoing struggle to balance the need for political funding with the imperative of maintaining a level playing field and preventing undue influence. Finding the right balance is crucial for preserving the integrity of democratic institutions and ensuring that political power is not determined by the wealth of donors, but by the will of the people. Electoral bonds were introduced in India in 2017 as a new instrument for political donations. These bonds are promissory notes issued by the State Bank of India, SBI, in denominations ranging from 1,000 rupees to 1 crore rupees. They can be purchased by any individual or entity, including corporate entities, and are valid for 15 days from the date of issue. The bonds can be redeemed by eligible political parties through their verified bank accounts. The stated objective of introducing electoral bonds was to enhance transparency in political funding. The government argued that they would reduce the reliance on cash donations, which were often made anonymously and lacked a proper audit trail. Electoral bonds were also intended to promote digital transactions and curb the flow of black money in politics. However, the scheme has been met with significant criticism, particularly regarding the anonymity it affords to donors. Critics argue that the anonymity associated with electoral bonds undermines the very transparency they were intended to promote. They contend that the scheme allows for opaque political funding, making it difficult to trace the source of donations and potentially facilitating the channeling of black money into the political system. The lack of transparency raises concerns about potential quid pro quo arrangements between donors and political parties, potentially influencing policy decisions. The process of purchasing and redeeming electoral bonds is designed to maintain donor anonymity. An individual or entity wishing to donate to a political party can purchase electoral bonds from specified branches of the State Bank of India, SBI, during designated periods. The purchaser does not need to disclose their identity to the bank. The bonds are issued in electronic form and can be transferred to the bank account of a registered political party. The political party can then redeem the bonds through their designated bank account. The SBI maintains a record of the bonds issued and redeemed, but the identity of the donor is not disclosed to the public or even to the recipient political party. This anonymity is a key feature of the electoral bond scheme, and it has been the subject of intense debate. Proponents argue that anonymity encourages donations and protects donors from political victimization. However, critics contend that it creates a breeding ground for opacity and potential misuse. The lack of transparency makes it impossible to ascertain the motives behind donations and whether they are intended to influence policy decisions. Supporters of the electoral bond scheme highlight several potential benefits. Firstly, they argue that electoral bonds enhance transparency by moving away from cash donations, which were often made anonymously and lacked a proper audit trail. By introducing a formal instrument for political donations, the government aimed to create a more accountable system. Secondly, proponents argue that electoral bonds encourage digital transactions and reduce the reliance on cash, thereby curbing the flow of black money in politics. By channeling donations through the banking system, the scheme aims to make it more difficult to make illicit political contributions. Thirdly, supporters contend that the anonymity provided by electoral bonds protects donors from political victimization. They argue that donors may be hesitant to openly support certain political parties for fear of reprisal, and that anonymity allows them to contribute without facing such consequences. This, they argue, promotes a more diverse and inclusive system of political donations. Despite the arguments in favor of electoral bonds, the scheme has faced significant criticism. Opponents of the scheme raise several concerns, primarily focusing on the anonymity it affords to donors. They argue that this anonymity undermines the very transparency that electoral bonds were intended to promote. Firstly, critics contend that the anonymity associated with electoral bonds makes it impossible to trace the source of donations, potentially facilitating the channeling of black money into the political system. The lack of transparency raises concerns about potential quid pro quo arrangements between donors and political parties, potentially influencing policy decisions. Secondly, opponents argue that electoral bonds give an unfair advantage to ruling parties. Since the SBI knows the identity of the purchasers, the government of the day can potentially access this information and identify its donors, even though this information is not publicly disclosed. This, they argue, creates an uneven playing field and undermines fair competition in elections. Thirdly, critics highlight that the scheme lacks safeguards against foreign funding of political parties, which is prohibited under Indian law. The anonymity provided by electoral bonds could potentially be exploited by foreign entities to influence Indian politics, posing a threat to national sovereignty. The introduction of electoral bonds has had a significant impact on the transparency and accountability of political financing in India. While the stated aim of the scheme was to enhance transparency, critics argue that it has achieved the opposite. The anonymity associated with electoral bonds has created new challenges for monitoring political donations and ensuring accountability. The lack of transparency makes it difficult to ascertain the motives behind donations and whether they are intended to influence policy decisions. It also raises concerns about potential conflicts of interest and the undue influence of wealthy donors on political parties. The absence of a clear audit trail makes it challenging to track the flow of funds and ensure that they are used for legitimate political purposes. The electoral bond scheme has also raised concerns about the role of the State Bank of India, SBI, in the political process. The SBI's involvement in issuing and redeeming the bonds has brought it under scrutiny, with critics questioning its independence and potential susceptibility to political pressure. The lack of transparency surrounding the scheme has eroded public trust in both the political and financial systems. The electoral bond scheme has been met with widespread criticism from opposition parties, civil society organizations, and legal experts. They have raised concerns about the lack of transparency, the potential for misuse, and the impact on democratic values. The scheme has also been challenged in the Supreme Court of India, which has expressed reservations about its design and implementation. Public opinion polls have also indicated a lack of support for electoral bonds. A survey conducted by the Association for Democratic Reforms, ADR, found that a majority of respondents believed that the scheme would increase black money in politics and undermine transparency. The survey also revealed that a significant proportion of respondents were unaware of the existence of electoral bonds or how they functioned. The widespread criticism and lack of public support for electoral bonds underscore the need for a more transparent and accountable system of political financing in India. The current scheme has failed to address the concerns about the influence of money in politics and has instead created new avenues for opacity and potential misuse. India is not alone in grappling with the challenges of political financing. Many democracies around the world have established regulations and disclosure requirements to ensure transparency and accountability in political donations. However, the approaches vary significantly, with some countries opting for full transparency, while others allow for varying degrees of anonymity. The electoral bond scheme in India stands out for its high level of anonymity, which is not found in most other democracies. This has led to calls for reforms to align India's political financing regulations with global best practices. Some experts have suggested adopting a hybrid model that combines transparency with limited anonymity for small donations, striking a balance between accountability and donor privacy. The introduction of electoral bonds in India has sparked a contentious debate about the role of money in politics. While the scheme was intended to enhance transparency, critics argue that it has achieved the opposite, creating new avenues for opacity and potential misuse. The anonymity associated with electoral bonds has undermined the accountability of political financing, raising concerns about the undue influence of wealthy donors and the potential for black money to enter the political system. The electoral bonds scheme has also highlighted the need for comprehensive reforms to address the broader challenges of political financing in India. These reforms should focus on strengthening disclosure requirements, enhancing the powers of regulatory bodies, and promoting transparency in campaign spending. The goal should be to create a system that ensures a level playing field, prevents undue influence, and upholds democratic values. The future of electoral bonds remains uncertain, with the Supreme Court of India yet to deliver a definitive judgment on their legality and constitutionality. However, the debate surrounding the scheme has brought the issue of political financing to the forefront of public discourse, prompting a much-needed conversation about the need for transparency and accountability in India's democracy.